If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, people who've claimed to encounter a humanoid, whether that be Bigfoot or whatever, what's your story? I saw a humanoid, something in the woods outside my childhood home. This was rural northern Wisconsin and I was 14. Up until that day I had zero fear of the woods. I spent most of my time out there exploring and feared nothing. My parents had a lousy marriage and fought a lot, and I felt more at home outside than in the house. On hot nights, I'd take a sleeping bag and sleep on the roof of an old shack on our property. I saw bears, I saw wolves. They were always more afraid of me than me them. I didn't believe in ghosts, Bigfoot, demons, or even God. I only got lost out there once when dark fell sooner than I expected. I stayed calm, found the North Star, and knew that if I continued south I'd eventually come across the old railroad tracks near my house. Even the thought of spending the night out there didn't bother me, the thought of my mom's rage when I didn't come home did. So it was summer, I had just turned 14. My mom had left my father worked all the time, sister was living on her own. Once school was out it was me and my cat, and this is before the internet or smartphones. We lived on a dead-end dirt road, and around noon I took my usual stroll down the long driveway to check the mail. My cat followed me everywhere, and I actually kind of relied on him to give me a heads up if there was a bear or something close by. A bit of movement behind me as I stood at the mailbox made me aware there was something across the road in the trees, but there were pesky deer everywhere. I heard a loud crash then, like something very loudly making its way through the brush. It's like every goddamned classic horror story. My brain had no capability for the thought of anything paranormal or spooky. I simply tucked the mail under my arm and headed into the woods to investigate. My cat followed close behind. I got about 10 yards in when I noticed what I hadn't noticed before: there was no noise. Nothing. It was a beautiful June day and there wasn't a single bird singing, no insects, no leaves rustling. It was absolutely silent. At the same time I registered the silence, I got that eerie feeling that something was watching me. I stopped immediately and started scanning the woods for deer. Hunters know what I'm talking about when I say you look for the shape of a deer instead of trying to pinpoint them by color. That's when I spotted it. 2 brown furry legs, the top of it concealed by tree branches. I went to sigh with relief when my cat hissed. I looked down and he was completely puffed out with his back arched. Looking at the same thing I was. I looked back up and the legs moved. Not like a deer. Like a human. Everything happened at once after that. I dropped the mail, picked up my cat by the scruff and ran for it. Whatever was out there with me was running after me. I have never run so fast in my life. I tore up the driveway, into the house, locked the door and grabbed the phone. I called my next door neighbor who was the ex-chief of police, and he came over immediately with his pistol. He checked out the spot I was in and found nothing. I was so hysterical I was in tears. He stayed with me until I was able to reach my mom and have her come get me. Of course they thought I was completely high or delusional. I know exactly what I saw and felt. It was broad daylight. I never felt safe in those woods again and stopped sleeping outside. I'm Native American, and I've always been pretty in tune with the spiritual realm, if you will. For as long as I can remember, I've had a spirit that stays with me. Always chalked it up as an imaginary friend, when I was a kid. I named him George, and he's been a blessing in my life. I've had plenty of paranormal experiences, but this one there was someone else who witnessed it. About 2.5 years ago, my fiancée and I moved into a new condo. We got pregnant about a month later, and I noticed that George had began clinging to my fiancée. He's always been a protector. Anyways, fast forward about another month, around Christmas time, I noticed that George wasn't around. Every night he was gone, I was visited by a little boy who was scared and running from something. That something was an evil spirit, in the form of a little girl. Every encounter ended him saying she's here, he'd vanish, and I'd be overwhelmed by this feeling of doom, then I'd see her. It got to the point that I was sleeping downstairs, to avoid the encounters. They seemed to stay upstairs, until my last real encounter. I walk into the kitchen, late one night, to get a glass of water. There was the little boy, huddled on the floor. He didn't acknowledge me. Which was odd, because he always came to me. He looks up, stares straight through me, and says goodbye. Just then the little girl appears, and takes him away, violently. Turns out he was staring through me, and at my wife. She had somehow managed to come downstairs, unnoticed. She's known about my experiences, but never seen one transpire. She knew, then, why I hadn't been sleeping in the bed. I'd had enough, and the next morning I go out and buy some sage. As my fiancée and I were cleansing the apartment, we began hear rather strange creaking noises. Almost as if the whole condo was shifting. We make our way upstairs, and right at the top of the stairs, a huge gust of wind blows out the sage. At that moment, George had returned. All was right, and the little girl hasn't since returned. My son is now 2 years old, and sees George. Even calls out for him. I think it's cute, as does my wife. It still kind of scares her, because she knows of the things I've dealt with. This happened when I was 7. I grew up on the military base. We lived in the PMQs, not entirely sure on the age of the houses, but our basement did have a bomb shelter in it. So I had just broken my leg and my dad moved my bed to the living room and set up my computer so I could play Buzz Aldrin's Race to Space whenever I wanted to. I was also given a frying pan and a pot if I ever needed anything in the middle of the night. So it's God knows what time, and am woken up by a sound. I look around and don't really see anything until I notice a hand peer out the entranceway to the living room. I immediately look at the TV to see if I can see a reflection. I do. It looks like a man my father's build and height, but the uniform is wrong. My father a few times was called and deployed on moment's notice. I could just tell this was a World War II uniform. So I freaked out. I grabbed the frying pan and pit and began slamming them together as hard as I could. The figure in the TV just walks away into the dining room and then turned to the kitchen from what I could tell. Just as he turns, my father is already in the living room asking what's wrong. I replied, someone's in the house. He immediately goes for his baseball bat and starts searching the house and checking the locks and windows, then gets on the phone and calls the MPs, and before I know it, he and the neighbors and the MPS are outside securing the whole damn neighborhood. They never found anyone, and I've never had a similar experience since then. My mom's Aboriginal, and as a kid, whenever we moved to a new place she'd always get to know all the black fellas in town. We made friends with a family who had an old uncle, not gonna mention his real name on here, so we'll just call him Jack. Uncle Jack used to spend a lot of time in the bush and he was fluent in the Noongar language. He told us lots of yarns about little hairy humanoids called Woodarchies. They're well known among Noongar people and are mischievous and can torment you if you piss them off. He told us one story that gave me chills as a kid. He was camping in his swag and his fire had died right down. He woke and there were 4 Woodarchies surrounding him. Standing at his head, feet on either side like points of a compass. He was too scared to move, so stayed stock still, trying not to look at them. At some point he drifted off to sleep and when he woke they were gone. They left a handful of rocks on his swag though. When I was in college, I lived in a dorm for native students. It was the first multicultural house in the Greek village, and we were so proud. About 9 of us lived there. The college was built on our tribe's old wintering grounds, and the school had disposed of things in a pretty shady way back in the 70s and 80s. Anyway, over the first few months we lived there, several of us noticed strange things. We weren't comfortable by ourselves. We'd see black people shapes out of the corners of our eyes. Somebody even swore they had a conversation with me, when I wasn't in the house. They said the me was a bit off and vacant and strange, but they couldn't figure out why. This happened with a few of us. Things were being broken and misplaced. We would hear strange wind noises sometimes. We finally went to someone in our tribe who dealt with things like this. He came and cleared the house with tobacco and water. We prayed, and cleansed ourselves. 2 of us stayed in the house while he worked. I distinctly remember him walking through the darkened living room, opening the door, and hearing what sounded like a tornado whiz through the room very quickly. Then it was over. Turns out it wasn't malevolent or anything. Just something that had attached itself to the land. We never had any problems after the cleansing. My husband and I saw a hellhound. We live in rural northern Idaho. And we both hunt. So we know everything about animals, even in pitch darkness. We don't have normal plumbing. We have to turn on an electric well every morning to fill it up. Our tank can last us 3 to 4 days, but we like it filled, just in case. There are other tanks like that scatter in the woods. Just waiting for someone to buy the land and build a home. We were talking a walk and it got dark, so we went back home. However, on our way home we saw something, not human or animal, like near the well. It was hunch over like it was eating. We walked carefully closer, about 20 feet from this thing. Trying to figure out what it is. Too large for a stray dog or wolf and too small for a bear. But whatever it was, it looked at us red eyes. I never been more scared in my life. My husband is scared of nothing and he was scared too. We took off running. My God, we never ran so fast in our lives. It did chase for a while, then it just disappeared. We got to our house and it was just gone. We knew it was behind us when we left the woods, but we couldn't see it. We locked all the windows and door that night. We talked to one of the town local about the thing we saw. He showed us a picture of a hellhound. He told us stories about people meeting the hellhound in the same area. Always near a well, roads, crossroads, or places of death. Seeing him once will bring us happiness, seeing him twice will bring us sorrow, and seeing him 3 times will bring us death. I don't know what we saw, but Hellhound is the only explanation. I was 7 or 8 years old and visiting my paternal grandparents with the rest of my family. They lived deep in the woods and I always hated it there. It felt like something was always watching, and was always eerily quiet. Like, not even crickets chirping. My little brother and I shared a bed in one room on the ground floor. My brother would sleep at one end, his head against the window/wall, and I would be on the other, facing the window. On this particular morning, I woke up first. The sun was brilliant, making the room gold through the curtains. And there, a silhouette against the window, was a deer with the biggest rack of antlers I had ever seen. It was right there, like almost pressed against the window in profile. I stared in awe. And that is when it changed. In one smooth movement, it reared up on its hind legs and it was no longer a deer, but a man. There were only 2 men in the area, my grandfather and my dad, and it was clearly neither, not sure if that made it better or worse. Grandfather was very built for his age, Dad had a gut. This silhouette was clearly younger, muscular, but not in the like a brick way my grandfather was. It exuded strength. And scared the hell out of me. It stared to the side for a moment, and then strode off with purpose. I don't know what I saw. I want to believe it was just the groggy mind of a half-awake kid. But I remember the fear slicing into me. I remember the feeling of something being out there. I was a baby when this incident happened, but I believe my sister, who was around 5 years old at the time. My cousins, aunts, and uncles were at a birthday party one Saturday at my grandmother's house in Houston. All the adults were inside the house around dusk, but the older cousins, ages ranging from 4 to 8, and my sister were outside, playing. My sister isn't sure who noticed the bird in the tree first, but soon all of the cousins noticed it as well. A bird was perched on one of the lower branches just staring at them. Before their horrified eyes, the bird began transforming until it was a woman. A woman sitting on the branch leering at them. As they began shouting and screaming for their parents, the woman became a bird again. By this time, the parents had come out to investigate the commotion, but the bird wouldn't budge. Not until my grandmother, a formidable and salt-of-the-earth type of woman, went outside, did the bird fly off. The house is creepy. It's still in the family and I've had some other strange experiences, as did my mother. It was in the family since my parents were young teens. My cousin owns it now and it's still creepy and old, and he doesn't really like living in the little yellow house either. In the beautiful roses my grandmother planted, strange things have been found. Animal bones, guts, melted candles, and other witchcraft type of things. A lady in white has been seen moving from room to room in the past by house guests. I've never shared this with anyone, so I'm sorry if it doesn't make sense. When I was about 7 years old, I was sitting in my bedroom with my friend Celia. We were playing. I think we were building with Lego. It was late afternoon and our parents were outside the front of the house chatting. My bedroom had a window at the side of the house. At some point while we were playing, I looked up and saw something on the other side of the window. I have no idea how to describe this thing, and I haven't heard anyone else mention anything that sounded similar. From the neck down, it looked like a person. I can't remember what it was wearing, but I think it was dressed in a dark blazer. The collar was visible, so I know it was facing us. From the neck up, everything started to look very wrong. Its head was heart-shaped, its skin was brown and leathery like the hide of an animal, but it was slightly translucent, and beneath the leathery skin I could see thick pulsing black and dark blue veins. There was no face. I remember looking at this thing for a moment and it was like my brain had fuzzed over being scared, and I remember thinking something like, no, that's not meant to be there. That's not what a person looks like. I remember mostly feeling surprised more than scared. I don't think I really thought it was real. I slowly turned my head to look at Celia and she was doing the same, turning her head to look at me. I saw her wide eyes and her mouth hanging open, and as I realized we could both see this thing, the fear clicked in and I thought, that's not a person, that's not a ducking person. What the duck is that thing that's not a ducking person? I remember being paralyzed with shock and fear. I wanted to bolt but I couldn't move. I suddenly felt really sick. Like the room was blurry and spinny. I don't remember the thing walking away, but one moment it was there and the next it was gone. Celia and I both stood up wordlessly and walked solemnly outside. I remember feeling unnaturally cold, wobbly and fragile, and a little too thin, like you do when you're coming down with the flu. We walked to the front of the house and we each grabbed onto a parent and snuggled into them until they finished their conversation. Celia and I never talked about it. My group of friends and I used to go drink and smoke at this really beautiful spot on a golf course in my town, surrounded by thick, lush forests. We arrived one night, are just chatting with one another as we walk down the golf cart path, passing the tree line when we all hear the most deep, horrifying and distorted growl emanating from the woods next to us, followed by what sounded like a sapling's being cracked in half. We froze. Exchange, did you hear that? What was that? Quickly turned on our heels and speed walked back to the car. The entire time, it felt like eyes were on us. I felt watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder because I was convinced I'd see some huge creature come barreling down after us. Got to the car, hopped in, locked the doors and ducking booked it. Never saw anything, but God was that creepy and strange. I have to mention, I live about 30 minutes outside of New York City. We have coyotes, foxes, raccoons, skunks and every now and then the occasional black bear. It sounded like none of these animals. Coyotes have high-pitched yelps and howls. I've been hearing them the entirety of my life. It wasn't them. Foxes and raccoons can make some god-awful noises, but they're also high-pitched. God only knows what noises skunks make, but I bet they're cute as duck. Black bear would make sense due to the deepness of the growl and the saplings being snapped, but they're not only incredibly rare, it just didn't sound like a bear, it didn't sound like a real animal. It really almost sounded like a wolf growl that somebody had ducked with on audio software, making the pitch rise and fall from deep to impossibly deep, making it sound garbled and strange. It seriously almost sounded digital in a way. I actually want it to be a bear just dicking around on a golf course, but I just don't. Went on a snowboarding trip with a buddy in Vermont and ended up getting to a half of the mountain that wasn't open that day. Started going down the trails even though the lifts weren't open. Once we got to the bottom, realized there was no way to get back to the main lift, but we did see a trail that kept going down. Decided to go down that trail, and after about 2 minutes of riding down deep powder realized it was a bad decision and we were completely lost. My phone was dead and my buddies had only a few %. Managed to call ski patrol to describe where we were and he said in the 30 years he had worked there he's never been down that trail. So we began hiking back up in the knee-deep powder and there was these footsteps going across the trail that were huge and deep. I'm terrible with measurements, but imagine if someone took those large snowshoes for hiking and made them into the shape of a foot. But they weren't just in the shape of a foot, they were about 2 feet deep, opposite of snowshoes, and there was about 3 or 4 feet between each step. I actually started laughing at how ironic it was that both of our phones were dead when we found them. Years ago, when I was around 8 or so, I stayed a week with my grandpa out in eastern Washington. We went fishing and rode the horses he owned, and went hunting. It was nearing the end of my stay and we were out real late one afternoon. Sun was setting and it was getting dark. I'm scanning the trees along the small dirt path we are following and basically not really paying attention, when my grandpa grabs me by the collar and yanks me behind him. I look up at the little clearing ahead and my grandpa has his rifle pointed at a grizzly bear perched on a large rock facing us. Only it's not facing us, its ducking head had been completely twisted around, and was backwards. The bear had been huge, especially in my 8-year-old eyes. I was pretty excited, although in hindsight my grandpa was terrified. He told me we were going to leave and was nervously looking everywhere on the way back to the car. I pretty much forgot about the incident for years until I remembered and asked him about it a couple years ago. He told me the bear's body was still warm and whatever killed it was close by. He is pretty sure it was Bigfoot. I was driving along a country lane with a friend. The sort of narrow lane that isn't quite wide enough for 2 cars to pass, flanked by tall hedges with fields and woods either side. It runs along the base of some large hills which have multiple ancient hill forts, settlements and quarries on them. There is also a World War II era bunker inside the hill with a tunnel running under the road to an old manor house. Supposedly some workers were buried alive when building the tunnel and the bodies are still there as they were too dangerous to recover. For some reason the road seems to have its own climate as well. You often get small little localized patches of fog that just hover above head height. Presumably because of this there are also various ghost stories around this road. Anyway, we're driving along on a dark, misty, wet night and we spot an old lady walking down the road with her back to us. Except there was something a bit odd about her. She was dressed in a long old style coat and hood and was completely white all over. I don't remember any color at all. She had an incredibly hunched over back and was sort of shuffling along. She is also really far from anything at 11 p.m. We initially drive past, but my friend says we should stop and offer her a lift as it is a horrible night and we are really far from any buildings. So I stop and reverse a little, but she is completely gone without a trace. There were no gaps in the hedge, nowhere to go. She had just vanished. We were a bit confused but decided to drive on. It was only then we realized quite how strange the whole thing was. To make it even stranger, a few days later I was driving along the same road, not far from where we saw the old lady. Then suddenly out of nowhere a huge white owl swept down from directly above my windscreen. It must have almost brushed the roof. I shit myself as I didn't know what it was and hit the brakes. I didn't stop completely as I saw it was an owl, so I kept going and the owl matched my speed, flying next to my car for a short distance before flying away when I reached a curve. It's the only time I've seen an owl that close, and whilst I don't really believe in the supernatural or anything, I still find the whole thing weird to think about. My friends and I saw some sort of dog-like demon thing, Hellhound if you will. We were exploring this old house out in the country after dark, just looking around with maybe some mild vandalism. Well, we had checked out the upstairs and most of the downstairs when I see a door that we hadn't been through yet. I grabbed the door handle and suddenly had a feeling of dread come over me. I slowly pushed the door open and noticed that the room was slightly lit up with a dim red light that had no discernible source. I got the door probably halfway open and heard an incredibly deep growl and saw the upper end of a dog thing, probably around the size of a German Shepherd. Its teeth protruded past its upper and lower lips a rather significant amount, and its stance was super hostile. The thing that really scared me though was its eyes. They were glowing red. I noticed that there was blood and viscera all over everything, chunks of flesh and organs all over the floor and streaks of blood on the walls. The smell was overpowering. I slammed the door and hightailed it out of there. Here's the part where I'm an idiot. I went back about noon the next day. I had a huge knife with me when I went back to the door, and slowly grabbed the handle, but felt none of the dread from the night before. I pushed it open and I shit you not, this perfectly square, windowless room, was literally coated in blood and fur. I could see what looked like 3 separate mutilated dog corpses. They weren't cut apart, they were shredded. I nearly threw up, shut the door, and left again. I'll never go back there again, especially after dark. I want to preface this by saying I've never had night terrors or sleep paralysis. My husband and I were houseguests at one of his friend's house while visiting Tucson, Arizona. He's a social butterfly, I'm more of a bookworm. After going out and playing card games, I decided to head back. I'd socialized as much as I could handle, and it was getting late. So, my husband dropped me off and I headed upstairs, read a book, and curled up in bed. As I drifted off, I had an uneasy feeling. A powerful sense of loneliness and foreboding. I wanted my husband to be home. I cracked my eyes open a sliver, and in the dark, I saw him. Or at least, someone, or something, shaped like him. A tall, wide man with short hair. I opened my eyes wider. "Parker?" I called out, staring at the shadow figure. As soon as I spoke, I heard a shrill, metallic note in my mind, like a musical chord from a throbbing gristle song. Somehow I just knew, that thing at the foot of the bed wasn't my husband. My mind fled then, back in time, back to childhood. All I could think to do was get under the blanket. When I finally peeked back out, the figure had vanished. I texted my husband, asking him to come home, and as soon as I hit send, the door opened and he walked in. I didn't see the figure again. But I did tell my husband's friend about it. He was nonchalant. "Oh, the farmer," he said. "Yeah, my mom's seen him too. 20 years ago on a family vacation in Austria. We stayed at this cabin, in the woods, parents like to hike, and I woke up in the middle of the night because I needed to go to the bathroom, which was located on the ground floor. I was about halfway down when I saw a dark woman's silhouette downstairs. I called out for my mom thinking it was her, but the silhouette didn't respond, just stood there. I called for my mom again and it started to move towards me still without responding to my calls. I realized that thing wasn't my mom and panicked, ran straight to my room and locked the door. Too scared to go back to sleep or go to the bathroom, stayed up till sunrise and nearly wet myself. After all this time I still remember this so vividly and I still haven't come up with a logical explanation for what I saw, which really isn't like me. Still makes my skin crawl. Boyfriend and I are also pretty sure we saw a UFO a couple of months ago. It was dark and at first we thought it was a drone or something because it was fairly close to the ground and didn't look like an airplane or helicopter. Except drones don't move like that, it was all over the place. We stared at it for about a minute when it took off faster than any human aircraft ever could. Unless there was some type of CIA top secret stuff going on, which I highly doubt, we saw a UFO. When I was 13, my friend's mom was driving me home in their SUV. My friend sat behind the passenger seat and I sat in the middle, uncomfortable, seat. Her mom took a back road that was fairly dark but quiet and residential. Suddenly something came running out across the road left to right. The headlights illuminated the thing. Her mom swerved and because I was in the middle seat I had a clear view of the road. It happened very suddenly, but her mom was so rattled she pulled over at the next subdivision. Turning back to me she said, "Did you see that?" Both our mouths were hanging open. My friend didn't see it because her view was blocked by the seat. What we both saw was roughly 3 feet tall, walked on 2 legs, Had human Caucasian colored feet that were mostly covered in thick brown hair. It moved quickly but in a stubby gait. It was almost like a gorilla and a hobbit mixed together. I didn't get a clear view of its face, but from its reaction being caught in the headlights of a car startled it. It ran out of the woods on one side of the road into the woods on the other side. Weeks later her mom took me aside and we discussed what we saw because she was so taken aback by what happened. I have no explanation for what this thing was. When I was around 12 or so, my mom and I lived in an apartment in Texas. She was a single mom, so it was just her and I for many years. I was and still am very fortunate that she puts me first and did her best to make sure I had what I needed. Unfortunately, her work schedule didn't allow for her to be home when I got off of school, so I usually had to take care of myself in the afternoons until she got off. It wasn't too bad. Usually by the time I fixed myself a snack and got through my homework, she was home. I should note that at this time, I was still sleeping with my mom. I initially started out in my own room, but I began having these horrible nightmares. It was the same dream each time. I was sleeping in my room and I could see a figure lurking in the hallway. I'd get up to turn on the light and someone would grab my hand and I would instantly wake up. The touch of that hand was the coldest feeling I'd ever experienced. It was so vivid in my mind. I felt incredibly sad, almost like the happiness was draining out of me. I started making excuses about wanting to sleep with her. My mom never made a big fuss about it. We would stay up late reading on a regular basis and I would accidentally fall asleep. I hated that room and avoided going in there at all costs. It got so bad that every morning before school, I would lay out a change of clothes in the living room so I could have them ready when I got home. My mom started to notice this routine and asked why I didn't just simply change in my room. I just made up some stupid excuse and brushed it off. I kept my bedroom door shut at all times and I would hurry past it if I needed to use the restroom. The dreams seemed to stay away once I stayed in my mom's room. It had been so long that I started to forget about them. One night my mom had already fallen asleep, but I was still nose deep in my latest library book. It was late, definitely past midnight, when I got an eerie feeling. I couldn't place it, but I was instantly uncomfortable. I put my book down and noticed a lump under the covers, toward the end of the bed. We had a cat at the time, but I knew it wasn't her because she hated anything on top of her. I stared at the lump and it started to move toward me. I froze. Every fiber in my body was screaming to move, but was paralyzed with fear. I finally mustered a weak mom and nudged her, all while keeping an eye on the lump. Finally my mom woke up and as soon as she spoke, the covers went completely flat, like a balloon whose air had been released. I went into a crying fit and told my mom what happened. She assured me that I was reading too much scary stuff before bed and my eyes had played tricks on me. I convinced myself she was right and went to sleep. One weekend I had a friend sleep over. My mom made a big deal about preparing my room for my friend and thought that maybe since I wouldn't be alone that it wouldn't be an issue. We did the whole typical sleepover shenanigans, played with each other's hair and gushed over our latest crush, all while listening to the newest NSYNC CD. I started to get anxiety as bedtime loomed closer. I somehow convinced my friend that it would be better if we made a bed on the floor in my mom's room because my room got hot or some shit like that. We quietly moved to my mom's room on the floor next to her bed and fell asleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke instantly and sat straight up. I was staring at a lump at the foot of my mom's bed. I suddenly became overwhelmed with the urge to touch it. I lifted the sheet and placed my hand upon the smoothest object I'd ever touched. I instantly felt every happy memory being sucked away from my body, all thoughts, emotions, were drained. I felt cold, colder than any weather I'd been through. I became empty, like a shell of a person. Nothing was left but numb darkness. It was as if I was under a trance. I somehow was able to pull my hand away and I threw myself against the wall. I stared at the lump until I fell asleep. The next morning, I retold what happened to my mom and she broke down in tears. She thought that this was all behind us, but clearly it was more than she previously thought. I didn't do much that day. My mom busied herself with Sunday chores while I stared blankly at the TV. As she stepped out for a bit to do some laundry, she ran into our neighbor. Her name has left me, but I remember her being a caring figure in my life and a wonderful friend to my mother. My mom confided in her about all the odd occurrences and her face went grim. Our neighbor was Native American and was super in tune with her culture and traditions. She explained to my mother that for some time, she's been feeling a presence and could not place its origin. My mom asked her to come inside to speak with me. She agreed, but upon stepping up to our door, she retreated. She said the origin was our apartment and the spirit would not allow her to cross the threshold. At this point, my mom was hysterical, as most mothers would be if someone told them an evil being was possessing her and her daughter's home. Our neighbor apologized, but promised she would gather what she could to help us. In the meantime, my mom reached out to my grandmother. Not that shit wasn't already weird, but shit got even weirder. My grandmother immediately told my mom to call my uncle. He had phoned my grandmother earlier in the day, asking about me, but didn't say as to why he was concerned, so my grandmother pretty much brushed it off. My mom called my uncle, and as soon as he answered the phone, he said, "I've been waiting on your call. We need to act now." It still gives me chills to talk about it. We weren't close with this uncle at all and hadn't talked to him in years. He told us that an evil spirit had possessed our home and he was going to help us get rid of it. He sent us a bottle of oil that was supposedly poured upon where Jesus was laid to rest. I feel as if that bit was a crock of bullshit, but whatever, it made it sound pretty legit. He instructed us to bless all doorways/entryways. This meant every door, closet and window. He gave us a prayer to repeat and told us to make the sign of the cross over each one. Our neighbor had also given us a dream catcher to place upon the bed frame the night we blessed the house. She made us swear to stay in our bedroom that night and not emerge until morning. My mom and I quickly blessed the house and both passed out of exhaustion. That night was the first night I had slept soundly since we moved in. My mom, however, laid awake the entire night. Whatever we did, pissed off the spirit. She said she held me tight and put her back toward the window as someone or something held, crying the entire night. It was terrifying screams, as if the realization had sunk and that we had shut the spirit out and it was no longer welcome. She said that night was the longest night of her life. To this day, I have no clue what I experienced. If my mom hadn't gone through it with me, I probably would have thought I was crazy. Seeing it laid out through text definitely makes it seem insane and completely unreal. When I was about 4 years old, I saw something in an older house in Midtown Sacramento that I still can't explain. This house belonged to the couple who would babysit me when my mom would have to work a closing shift at the diner she waitressed at. Most visits to the babysitters were unremarkable. I remember that the husband had a whole room devoted to model trains and that they were nice people who treated me well. I never minded having to go over there. Usually, my mom would show up pretty late at night to come pick me up. So the female babysitter would put me to sleep on some cushions on the floor of the living room, and she'd fall asleep on the couch right above me. This particular night, I couldn't fall asleep. This is still fairly common for me. I don't fall asleep easily in silence and darkness, and was just kind of lying there and staring at the wall in the dark. Along this wall, there was a table or a desk of some sort, I remember. So I was staring at this general spot, not sleeping, when I see this grayish humanoid shape kind of glide or slide out from under the table and stand before me. It was too dark to really see details or colors. All I remember was that it was about 2 or 3 feet tall, shorter than me as a 4-year-old, and appeared to either be holding a spear or sword or perhaps wearing a pointy hat. I remember being terrified and hiding my face under the covers for some time. Eventually, I heard a faint swishing sound and I looked to see the figure was gone. I shook my babysitter awake and told her that I'd seen a ghost, and she told me I was dreaming and to go back to sleep. The thing is, I hadn't been sleeping. To this day, I have no idea what I saw. In Sacramento, I have heard stories of creatures called duendes or duendles, but most sightings are dismissed as opossums, which makes sense. Anyone else ever see anything like this or have heard of anything like this? What did I see that night? Ghost, goblin, duende? A possum with a spear? This was a few years ago. 2013, maybe. I was staying with some friends up in Kentucky. They were attending Moorhead U, and I would hang out with them in the evenings after class. One night after sundown, we got the bright idea to go for a short trail hike down by the river. We pulled into the parking lot, parked, and headed off into the woods with flashlights. After about a half hour or so, we see flashlights coming in the other direction. No voices, just flashlights. We get a little closer and see a few people coming quietly toward us. I just assumed they were night hiking like us. Weird, but whatever. I guess everybody was just being weird that day. Soon a few people turn into 20, then 40, and then it seems like there are 200 people shuffling through the woods in the middle of the night. All ages: kids, adults, teenagers, elderly people. None of them said a word to us. It looked like some kind of weird Trail of Tears or Auschwitz reenactment, just hundreds of random, various people marching through the middle of nowhere in a massive straggling line, in the middle of the night. All of a sudden I suspected that they might have been some kind of cult, molestation or otherwise. The fact that they had these school-age kids out there in the dark was weird as shit. We decided that it was time to pack it in and head home, and get away from whatever shady shit these people were doing. A man broke away from the gaggle and confronted us. "You need to get out of here." He was carrying a rifle. "Some of us have weapons and you might get shot. We're looking for an escaped prison inmate." Do you need a bunch of kids and old people for that? I don't feel like that's a thing that's necessary? Question mark? We didn't need him to repeat himself. We beat feet. When we got back to the parking lot, there were men wandering around directing cars like ushers at a drive-in cinema, except they looked like some kind of homegrown militia. Now the parking lot was crammed with cars. And someone had set up a command post at the edge of the woods, with a video village under a rain awning. It looked legit as hell. One of the men approached us again as we were heading for the parking lot to leave. As assholes are prone to doing, he told us to do what we were already doing: get the duck out of there. I don't remember exactly what was said, but he got belligerent when we asked him what they were doing, and kept telling us to leave. So we did. We ended up going to Wendy's, where one of their friends was getting ready to close, and we sat in the lobby drinking milkshakes and trying to piece together what the duck was going on out there in the woods. Finally, I think we all convinced ourselves that we'd stumbled across some kind of eyes wide shut style sex ring convention. Later that week we found a mention in the newspaper about some kind of Bigfoot hunting gathering out there. Naturally we assumed that's what we'd seen, but why kids? Why elderly people? Hardly any of them looked like they were ready for action. I saw people wearing blankets as if they were shawls. They looked like they were being herded somewhere. Why so many people? How the hell are you gonna find Bigfoot with that many people stomping around in the woods? I live in a brand new house in an outlying area in Arizona. I decided to move here because after my online business took off, I'd moved into an older hipster loft apartment downtown and found it thoroughly haunted. I mean, the entity would physically manifest itself in my room. It tore down my shower curtain. I came home to find food already prepared and eaten with a huge mess left over. The truly creepy thing was that I had a healer come to my apartment to try and get them to leave. What was insane was the physical manifestation of them left, but then the entity, he's a Depression-era restaurateur, who committed suicide in his car by running it off into a canyon. His restaurant was in my old building, which I could have never known until he told me, took up space in my head exclusively. He would talk to me, he would guide and critique my actions, and generally made life a living hell for me. My healer said that his presence was enhanced by my connection to his old building and I needed to move far away. So I moved to a brand new community literally springing up out of the desert. For many months I was free of him, but as far as I can tell he has found me again and has now started to physically manifest himself within my new house. I'm not as afraid of him this time, and I've set solid limits that he is 100% not allowed to take up space in my head, and so far he's honored that, but he still makes messes in the kitchen, which I assume is because of his failed restaurant. As long as he doesn't occupy space in my head, I feel pity on him and I'm happy to find him help in crossing over. I have several calls in for all sorts of priests and healers that can help me out. When I was a kid, probably just hitting puberty, I awoke to something standing over my head. It had 4 arms, it was brown and tall, it had no hair but skin-toned extensions from its head, tentacles. It held my arms down with its 2 upper arms, and then its rib arms grabbed my little boobs and started squeezing the crap out of them. It hurt so bad, I can remember trying to fight and screaming. Next thing I knew, I was braced up against the wall crying my eyes out and hyperventilating. I distinctly remember being afraid to lie down in case it came back, and I was too afraid to go to my parents' room. I've only told my husband about it. BC, the trapped feeling is akin to sleep paralysis, which I experience a lot, along with hypnagogic hallucinations, which I don't think is all because of sleep deprivation. Those hallucinations haven't been too scary or bad, and sometimes very spiritual. No, I'm absolutely sure I was never molested, but it was terrifying. Other crazy ass shit has happened since my dad died, but I'm trying to focus on school right now and I ignore any of those other weird crazy things. I've been to a psychiatrist and asked him if I was nuts out of it, but it's been a consistent no. There is no history of psychosis in my family either. So when I was about 15 to 16, I woke up like normal. Everything in my room was illuminated, so I figured it was morning, nothing out of the ordinary. Room looked lit, it would in daylight. I checked the time, probably to see how late to school I was for that day, and both my watch and laptop said it was like 2 to 3 a.m. in the morning. Bit weird. I then noticed someone standing at the end of my bed. They'd have to be about 4 feet tall, hard to remember as my mattress was on the floor at this point in time. They were Caucasian skin colored, white/pink, with a weird overgrown head, kind of like a baby, and big round stern eyes. Not like angry or cross, but very serious looking. I don't remember freaking out or anything, cause as I was looking at them their face was getting mixed and jumbled up, kinda, so I couldn't recognize anything. I then felt someone walk into the room on my right. I say felt because I couldn't see anything. Everything on that side of the room in my vision was blank. Not black, just not existing. This is where it all ended and I felt myself fall back asleep. I'm a pretty vivid dreamer, and get sleep paralysis a lot, so this isn't something completely weird for me. Even though it wasn't like anything else that's happened before, and I pieced most of this together in the coming day or so after it happened. I can try to describe it better. Stick figures is about I had drawing ability wise lol. It was running at my car straight in between the tracks. There are 4 sets of tracks. Semi-trucks unload logs on trains beside the crossing. It had a man's body and it was running on all 4s hunched over. Long floppy ears and was so black it stood out. There's one weak-ass street lamp over the crossing so there was no light shining on it to make its eyes glow. They look like hot coals. That's actually what scares me the most. That and the unnatural way it was running. We was singing and laughing until that point so I didn't know a car was behind us until I glanced back. This was a good many years ago so the exact make I don't know. It was silver. A mid-90s small 4-door sedan. I never let off of the gas after I saw it and she didn't stop screaming for what seemed like hours but was really just minutes. When I felt the tires cross over the last set of tracks and heat solid pavement, I glanced in my rear view and saw it standing still by the front passenger door. It was still on all 4s but its back wasn't hunched anymore. I guess cause it wasn't running, I don't know. Before you cross the tracks on the right is a small white house my friend lived in during her childhood. Her mom told me she had to call the cops every night for a week cause something would beat on the windows at night. Her husband worked nights and it freaked her out. I don't even know if the 2 incidents are related but is a pretty big coincidence. My friend that was with me blocked it out, I guess. She wouldn't talk about it after that night and never has. She said when she first noticed it she could see its teeth. It almost looked like it was grinning. Everybody calls that road Tin Can Hollow Road. They have called it that so long, who knows what the real name is. I hope this helped explain it better. I never heard anything about a death or anything that night. For a split second I saw it and I still can see it when I think about it. It was defiantly humanoid. I think it wasn't supposed to be there, or maybe we wasn't, hell who knows. I thought me and her was having the same hallucination. I could have convinced myself that easier than I could explain what we saw. When I looked back and seen it beside the car, the hallucination theory went straight out the window. The scariest part was we both had our windows down. It was a warm summer night. My windows were old school up and down with your hand types. I am glad she screamed. It put me in flight or fight mode. We would have probably not been able to roll the windows up in time. I would love to find the car behind us. They no doubt seen it too. Something like that I believe is a once in a lifetime sighting. At least I hope it is.